Hi, I'm Joel Persinger. Once again, I've got another great lesson for you from our little Bible group, which, if you've watched this at all, you know is a group of people composed, well, basically we all come from different denominational backgrounds. So it's a fascinating group as a result of that because we're not stuck in one mode. The lesson moves around from person to person. Everybody gets to teach a lesson if they want to, and no one leads the group except the Messiah. So that's pretty cool. This week, Rick taught the lesson, and it's a lesson that's near and dear to his heart. He taught a lesson on the people that wrote the Bible. Now, he makes the point at the beginning, and I will make it too, that God wrote the Bible, but we know from Scripture that he did so by moving the hearts of people to write things down. I think the other part that we want to be very mindful of is that they wrote based upon what was going on in their society and in their lives at the time. And that's what Rick delves into here, as well as the order in which the books of the New Testament were written. So it's a really great study. I was completely enthralled with it, as was everyone else, which is why as a group we decided to share it with you. So without any more preamble, here's Rick and his lesson, The New Testament, God's Writers.
So, well, sorry to Jim. We're not spending a lot of time in the Old Testament today, but we will make some references to it. So, but today we're going to be primarily in the New Testament and talking about God's writers. So these are the writers and the books as we know them in their order. So Matthew is written by obviously the disciple Matthew. Mark is written by a guy named John Mark, who we'll talk about a little bit later. Then there's good old Dr. Luke, who writes Luke and Acts. And then there's John. And then there's Paul, who writes Romans all the way through Thessalonians on this side. And then the letters to Timothy, Paul, and Philemon. Hebrews is a huge debate. If you ever want to have fun in a Bible college, go in and start asserting who you think wrote Hebrews and watch the room divide. It is so much fun to do. Then you have James, which is written by one of Jesus's half-brothers. And then you have Peter, who's a disciple, who writes both 1st and 2nd Peter. And then you have John, who does 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. Jude, who's also a half-brother of Jesus. And then Revelation's John. And most of us tend to read the Bible either, like if we're trying to do that famous, I'm going to read the Old Testament, New Testament, or just one of the Testaments. We read it from the starts to the finishes. And then often we go back and forth. Some of us just play the game of show me where to go, Spirit, and you open up the book and look wherever it goes. However, I will tell you that if every day you open up the Bible and ends up the same place, move the bookmark. That'll probably help you get to other parts of the Bible. But this is kind of the way we see it. But I think where this is interesting is all of us, whether that we were following Jesus or not, were around during the 70s and 80s when there was a huge push in the church here in America to be like the early church. We got to get back to our early church roots. We got to do things the way the early church did it. And this is where I became fascinated because when I was in school, I took a couple honors classes before I went to Bible college. And one of them, I had the privilege to work with a former Jesuit priest who was there at Qumran, which is in the Dead Sea, working on Dead Sea Scrolls. And spent a lot of time with him, both in class and after class, because I was just soaking up everything like a sponge. And it was interesting because at Qumran, you learned that there were certain scrolls that there are a lot of, like 1st and 2nd Samuel and stuff. But that community did not have the entire Old Testament. You know, it's very easy to sit and go, well, Jesus hadn't come yet. But when you went to the synagogue had the entire Old Testament. No, they didn't. And some synagogues barely had the first 5 books of the Bible. Some synagogues might only have, which I cannot imagine, but might only have Numbers. They might only have Deuteronomy because that's what they could afford in that community. So imagine growing up in a place of worship with one book. That's it. How would that change? You know, what would the impact be on your faith, your learning, everything else? And so I think this is important when you start to look at the writers and you start to learn how the New Testament was developed to where we see it today. And there's also a lot of faith building in here. So let's go to the oldest New Testament copies that we still have. We have many of the single books that date to the 200s. This is important because that means literally we're within 100 years of original copies. That is just, you look at any historical text, that is incredible for historical texts that are sometimes a couple thousand, 4,000 years old. A lot of stuff that we look at Egypt is much older copies on papyrus. Same thing with a lot of the Middle Eastern empires, Persian empires. A lot of stuff is copies of copies of copies of copies, like infinitum. The complete New Testament was in the 300s or 4th century, and that is the Codex Sinaiticus. And this is how it looked to the right. Those are the books of the New Testament that people had. Obviously, they're in different orders. Some things are the same, some things aren't. And there's a couple of extra books. And so why this is important, other than like, oh, that's interesting, I never knew about the Codex, is because a lot of the things that we hear, like the Council of Nicaea, the Apostles' Creed being developed, another council we'll talk about today, is these were tensions that the church fathers and church leaders were trying to solve. And so this codex was at the heart of one of the tensions because it has a couple of books that were believed by most of the church fathers to not be inspired by God. So there were writers, but not every writer was inspired. And that's the first point I wanted to make. So the order that we know, just if you ever were curious, was laid out by, or gets attributed to a guy named Anathias of Alexandria. Alexandria's church was incredibly huge, incredibly powerful as a leader during that time period. And in his letter 39, he had, I think, just under 50 letters. He laid out the current order of the New Testament. So if I could ask someone go to 2 Corinthians 11:3. Now, one of the things that someone scanned down, I want you guys to remember, is a lot of churches didn't have all the letters. They didn't have, it was going to be some time before everybody had everything. And so 2 Corinthians, I mean, we all love 1 Corinthians because why? The love chapter, chapter 13. But 2 Corinthians was very, very popular during the early church. So if someone's got 11:3.
I got it. But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ.
Yeah, and if you go on and read, there's Paul's talking to the Corinthians about all the things that could lead them away. And he used 2 Corinthians 11:3. People evidently were memorizing, which is good, that books that were not inspired would be detrimental to the church. And so they were called apocryphal. And at that point, there were some parts of the church that were contentious and held on to some of the different apocryphal books. A lot of that was geographically influenced. You would see like the book of, going back, I want to say it right, yeah, of Hermas, the Shepherd of Hermas. That would be like in the Palestinian area, but you wouldn't find it in Egypt. You wouldn't find it like in Asia Minor, but you would find one of the other books. So it wasn't like everybody was clean, but different people had different apocryphal books. Okay, and so that was a tension. So the compositional order of writing, this order offers insights into what early Christians were first exposed to. So something to realize, the church did not have a full Bible until the 500s. It's interesting when you think about it. And a Bible that all could read in their language began in the 1500s, and thanks to a couple of different groups today, still continues. But there are still many people in the world that do not have the full Bible translated into their native tongue, which is just so hard for us to believe. Now, that may speed up with some of the computer stuff that people like Kelly works on, but that's just, it's interesting to me. Compositional order also reflects the issues the writers were tackling at the time. And so this is something I think that a lot of us as Christians don't always consider. How many of you, and you can just raise your hand since we're doing this, but how many of you have ever heard somebody say, well, the Bible doesn't address stuff today? Okay. So some of you are either lazy or you're lying. But anyway, so we've all heard that. So here's what's really interesting. If you flip that, you'd have to sit there and say, well, are the things we're tackling today different than what they tackled 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? No, they're not. There may be different concepts wrapped around, but the base is the same. And so going back to look at like, okay, well, how did they deal with this? What was God's answer to them? God's consistent. So the answer is going to be the same to us. Now, we don't always like that consistency, and we've had other Bible talks about that. We a lot of times rebel against that consistency, but God's always consistent. Compositional order also gives a historical context to when this was written. And, it's amazing to me because everybody likes to take things to extremes, but, are there things today that we say it'd be better to have people isolated and not with the masses, not to get them sick? So some things, I'm not advocating that women should go outside the city for a week at a month at a time. But what I'm getting at is there are issues that we sometimes completely discount when we shouldn't, because God was given direction on when things aren't clean or aren't safe. So Marcus Borg is a pretty famous theologian in the modern time. And so what he started to do was he wrote a book called The Evolution of the Word. Don't agree with everything in it, but he did put down these dates as the dates of when the different books. So there are 3 books that is a big source of arguments: First Thessalonians, Galatians, and James, of which one was written first. So one of the points I wanted to make was you can actually see that most scholars are going to agree that Thessalonians, Galatians, the first book of Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, and Second Corinthians and Romans all became before a gospel. All those things were out before a gospel. And this kind of sets up some interesting points of how God chose to write his word. These are now the consensus dates by New Testament scholars. And this was pretty much as of like 6 years ago. Everybody's kind of settled in here. Galatians is the first book. It was the first letter. So think about Galatians. Jesus dies roughly in about 30 to 33 CE. So for the first arguably almost 20 years, it was all word of mouth. It was all street witnessing. It was all having somebody like Jim at his workplace going, well, you know what I heard? Blah, 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 blah. And there was no reference to go back.
Just out of curiosity,
Yeah.
was that driven by the fact that during that time, Christianity was really considered a cult by the
We're
Romans,
going to get there.
and was oppressed like crazy during that
wait,
time.
we're going to get there.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of you. I apologize.
Back, Joel, back.
Yes, that's right. Just slow your roll there. Okay, I got it. Sorry about that.
But as we go in today to look at this is going to be pretty interesting. And so everybody knows there were issues with the previous thing, the historical questions, such as big issues like the fall of Jerusalem. That's a big thing that happens during the writing of the New Testament. It's absolutely huge. And yet in many books like Hebrews, for example, Hebrews is warning the Jews about a lot of things, right? Well, you wouldn't write all these warnings. Like, think about today. Pete might write a book back in, say, 1999 that said, hey, people of New York, people of New England, people of the United States, you better get your stuff together, or, I'm prophesizing that buildings are going to fall and government structures are going to get blown up and wars are going to happen. Well, if he wrote that in 2020, we'd all be like, thanks, Captain Obvious, because it's already happened. But if he wrote it prior to it happening, then people would be like, oh, I know, but, Pete might know something. He might have a connection to God, because Pete called it, like, you see what I'm getting at? Timing of the journeys, the 3 different missionary journeys of Paul, the audience into which they were written, and what was going on in the church. So wait, sorry, wrong way. So the first big one is the Jerusalem Council. So this happens in 50. And one of the things that Joel, when he was jumping ahead and I was going to talk about, was a lot of this stuff is happening under the reign of Nero. Nero had an absolute rule. Nero was God incarnate, and anything that did not recognize that must be destroyed at all costs. Roman soldiers, the only time in Roman history, they were actually rewarded with land and money and rank very quickly, was for finding people. And Pete will know who I'm talking about. Some of you may or may not, but I am reading Pappy Boynton's book right now. And some of you may have remembered Baba Black Sheep when you were younger, but Boynton, when he joined the Flying Tigers, the only reason he joined them was because there was a bounty of like $400 for every plane you knocked out of the sky. And he thought this was going to be easy peasy, and he was going to have a house in Hollywood, and he was going to do this. And I thought about that with this because Roman soldiers are kind of getting the same gig. Like, find us a Christian, and you get a field. Find us a Christian, you get a house. Find us a Christian, you get a wife. Like, that's an incentive to go after people. And you also have to look at like God's handling in this. It's talked about in Acts 15. So if any of you open up your Bible, Acts 15, most of the headings on it will say the Council of Jerusalem. But most of us read through that and don't think like, what was this council? And this council was because one of the things happening in the early church was Jews saying, Pete, you can't be a Christian because you're not following Mosaic law. You're not doing everything the Pharisees and Sadducees said you should be doing. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. And it was Peter, John, and James all going, Jesus said they don't have to. They don't have to do these things. And so this was all the early church leaders coming. There were people saying, okay, but Pete's got to eat this way and that way. And there were some things that was like, yeah, Pete, you shouldn't eat meat that's got all this blood in it. You should, get it so it's kosher. Forbidden practices, all these things like no more idolatry. That's an absolute, but this, maybe not. That was a tension within the church. And that tension is actually in Acts 15. So you can go read it and see like, oh, so Acts 15 had to be written after the Council of Jerusalem because it's talking about the Council of Jerusalem. But you don't think about that when you're just reading. The Laodiceans, we all know them about as the Church of Laodicea, but what we may not realize is that in 58 to 61, there's a little bit of argument over which year this finally came to a head, but it had two major, it was a divided city. So it wasn't just a hot or cold. It was divided over, do we worship Zeus or do we worship Hermes, the god of messaging, the FTD guy, the symbol of track and field. Christianity was taking hold, and Laodicea was like one of the it was like New York City Stock Exchange. It was like the major economic power in Asia Minor from Rome. It was like where you went to do everything. This is a rebuilt from an artist over the structures that still the bases exist in that area of just how big this place was. It was huge. And this is where one of the most powerful churches that we read about in Revelation had been established. So you have like this three-part tension that a lot of that spills over into some of Paul's writings. So we know those writings had to come after this tension and this explosion happened within Laodicea that ended the both Hermes and Zeus's temples were dismantled during that time period. Okay? And then the other big one is this one, the biggie. So that is the Arch of Titus, I think. I always forget the emperor. But anyways, it is the arch that is in Italy that tells all about the emperor who destroyed Jerusalem. A lot of people know about the destruction of Jerusalem, that the temple gets destroyed. But what you may not know is the Romans started the siege during Passover. They literally put out signs, Jim, come to Jerusalem for Passover. Like the Romans were like all about Passover for like the month leading up. They wanted every Jew they could get into Jerusalem. And once they all got in it, then they sealed the city because they knew that so many Jews would wipe out the water and the food supply and they could win the siege. And then they marched in and destroyed the temple. They destroyed the majority of the cities, people's homes, slaughtered. It's considered one of the most gruesome Roman sieges and destructions in Roman history. And that's saying a lot because Rome did some pretty hideous things when you look at their military. So the book of Hebrews, like I said, would make little sense if it was written after the fall of Jerusalem. So does that kind of give everybody a couple of different references, points, like as it's being written? Flavius Josephus, most of us just know him as Josephus, very controversial guy, but he was writing for the emperor about all this and was a historian. Very interesting to read. There's about 3 pages in his big, huge book all about Jesus. And you got to remember that when Josephus is writing, he's writing to, in his world, God, telling him, yeah, you might think you're God, but there's this guy that died on a cross because we did it, and he rose from the dead, and he did all these things that you can't do. And there's a lot of people saying he's God. And he's doing this before Christianity is a recognized religion. To your point, Joel, it's still a cult, a very deadly cult to the Roman Empire. And Flavius doesn't get whacked for it. So it's really interesting. And Flavius's writings hold. So those are always the writings that I've used with some people are like, well, how can I trust go read Josephus. He's trusted by every scholar in every place for everything else about Rome. So this is what he had to say.
Hey, quick question.
Sure.
When Rome came in and was wiping out people, they spared no quarter no matter what your rank was, right? So the priests and the Pharisees, they were all reduced to dust like everybody else. That was caught.
Like the only thing that survived of the temple is what we see today as the Western Wall, where the Jews put the little things in. That's the only thing they left.
Do you think it was God allowing that to wipe out all the false teaching?
Well, yeah, if you read the Old Testament, there's a prophecy that the temple will fall.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
So, yeah, Rome was the tool that God used to accomplish what he said would happen.
It's also
and at that point, the Jews have rejected his son.
Right.
It's also kind of cool that Jesus told the disciples that this was going to happen. And so and I'm sure that got out. Yeah. So if you were a disciple of Jesus, it's possible that you were, of course, in Jerusalem when this happened, but there's a good chance that you listened to what Jesus said and you were out in the hills, far away from the city.
Well, we know none of the original disciples were in Jerusalem when it fell. They had all fled. So to your point, yeah. And there's a lot of discussion. I don't think anybody's going to ever be able to prove it one way or the other, but there's a lot of people that said that after Christ's resurrection and ascension, the close disciples and the apostles and the people following at that time during Pentecost quit practicing Passover because it was like Jesus fulfilled Passover. Like, we're not going to go to that party and do all that stuff anymore. So whether that's true or not, I don't think there's sufficient evidence, but it's an interesting point.
I'm really, thank you very much for this. This is a great lesson. I've been kind of reading books and looking at the history of that time, and I always knew that the church was oppressed, but I think when you find out to the degree to which the monster known as Nero did what he did, and certain emperors following that, I just was reading a book about finding Peter's tomb, and it was interesting how long
That's a great book.
It's a great book. I just finished it. I stayed up last night and finished it. But just how long Margarita Garducci worked on the red wall down there just to decipher what they thought were meaningless scribbles on the wall under the Vatican, and then to find out that so much of this was almost like hieroglyphic code that the Christians used to communicate to each other because they couldn't communicate openly. That's It's a horrific thing that the early church went through, and it's a miracle of God that we still have any church at all after the Romans got done with it.
To that point, I don't want to get political, but a lot of times you'll have Christians today in America go, well, we're not being persecuted, which I would argue vehemently against that. But one of the things that happened during that same time of Nero was everybody's heard the term decimate, but decimate means 1/10 would be sacrificed in the Roman military. That's where it comes from. And so if a legion did something wrong, it'd be every 10th person stepped forward and they would be killed for that crime. And there was one legion in what's today Spain that became Christians, and Nero lost it. And he said, we'll see how long they'll stay Christian, decimate them. And so one line comes out, dies. Now, do you still believe in God? And on their own, to the last man, everybody stepped forward and was killed. And that spread. And I thought, well, you're never going to have 10,000 people like persecuted like that at once in the military. And then yet right now there's a whole thing going on in our government because 10,000 people were fined and labeled as possible terrorists within the United States Army for being Christians back in 2018. And that's now going through Congress. And I was like, and we're not talking about it. So like my thing was, how could 10,000 members of a legion be nailed that way and Christianity not explode in that part of it? Well, the same way it happens today. Like, people just aren't paying attention. But yeah, it's really interesting. So this is the emerging.
There's one other, Rick. There's one other point about the destruction of Jerusalem that's interesting. At the time of Jesus' birth, Jews could trace their lineage back to Abraham on paper. All the records were kept, and those records were kept in Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And when Jerusalem was destroyed, all of those records were destroyed. So after 70 AD, no Jew can physically trace their lineage back. So everything that was important in the lineage that we see recorded in the Gospels doesn't exist any longer. But at the time, they all could. It's like the Amish being in the book. The Jews could go to the book and say, see here, I'm here to here to here to here to here to here. And there's Abraham. And that's me.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So this is the merging order of what most of people are looking at. So Galatians and James. Then you have the Jerusalem Council that we talked about. Then Mark through Philemon are written. And then we have the crisis at Laodicea. Then comes Matthew, Luke, Philippians, all the way through Revelation, destruction of Jerusalem, and then John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John are written after the destruction of Jerusalem. So it kind of gives you the three landmarks during the time of the writing. So why is all this important? What does it have to do with anything, Rick, other than taking us down weirdness on a Sunday morning? So writers write because they're driven to. So if you look at Galatians and James deal with the Gentile controversy of what to do with Gentiles in this new emerging following Jesus Christ. And they are pre the Jerusalem Council. So when you're reading Galatians and James, you can read not just what God is speaking to you. Galatians is focusing mostly on what today would be considered the Celtic and Gaulish people who were all over from Turkey to France. At that time, it's talking to them. James is talking. You're getting the massive debate that was going on in all these different churches, and you're getting to see, like, no, this is for me. I'm a Gentile, and I have a right in the church, and this is where it came from. That's where this is at. And then you have the Jerusalem Council. Then you get the book of Mark, which is post the council on the Gentile controversy, and Jude. And Mark becomes very famous. So we're going to talk about the Gospel of Mark. It's the first one written. Now, for you, Joel, the very top, it's written in Rome to a Roman audience during Nero's reign. So here's Mark in the belly of the beast.
Literally, when Nero is wrapping them in cloth, covering them with oil, and using them as human torches to light his garden. I mean, this guy was horrible. I mean, that talk about courage. Wow.
And if you go to Colossians 4:10 or 2 Timothy 4:11, you find out that John Mark is Barnabas's cousin. And we all know Barnabas, working with Paul. He's also called in Acts 15:36-41 the deserter because he leaves Paul. He's like, I got other things to go do. But here's what's interesting. When you read the Gospel of Mark, it is written from Peter's eyewitness testimony. John Mark hung out with Peter. So Peter puts down the gospel using Mark as his writer and lays down his eyewitness of everything that happens. So when you're reading Mark, you're listening to Peter tell you the story of Jesus Christ. And that's phenomenal for two reasons. One, we do get Peter's viewpoint. But more importantly, or just as importantly, you could argue either way, Peter didn't write to the Jews. Remember, Peter wasn't so happy with the whole idea of, wait, Jesus, like, non-Jews get you? Remember, Peter was kind of at that center of the initial start of the controversy. Wait, we got to be nice to the Gentiles? Like, and who does Peter pick? He picks a writer to write to who? The kingdom of the Gentiles, the Romans. And so now when you look at the Gospel of Mark, it just adds a richness to it of like, this is part of the four Gospels of Jesus, but this one is written specifically to us. And it's written under a lot of tension and a lot of like this guy is like public enemy number one for Nero. Yeah.
So The Chosen, I think, has opened my eyes a little more to The Chosen and just seeing the way that they're doing the interaction between Peter and Gaius then, and it makes more sense to me with that. Like,
right.
I know that they've really researched a lot of this, which makes a lot of sense then to me to go, whoa, oh, okay. So this, Peter's interaction into that anyway. So yeah, just kind of like light bulb.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've really thought about, because I agree with you, that is one of the things that The Chosen kind of opens up a little bit. I mean, we don't know if any of those conversations ever took place, and I know Pete and I've had those talks before, but one of the things it does make me think about is all of us, I think, at one point or other are like, really, Lord, I have to stretch this far to meet this person where they're at, or you're really sending me in on this one? Come on, God. Like, why me? Like, because we just, it's a tension we don't want to go do. And yet, sorry. There we go. Peter does it. And Peter doesn't just go to the edge. Peter goes downtown with John Mark. And so I just thought I wanted to make sure we highlighted that. The pattern continues. Every one of these, there's theological questions, and these letters are written post. So like First Thessalonians is written. So like when you read First Thessalonians, the letter from Paul, you should be reading it from Paul has already been there on a missions trip. He's already hung out with the people in Thessalonians. They all slammed him with a bunch of questions, a bunch of tensions. See, Sylvia did this, and Jim didn't do that, and it's literally Paul going, okay, here's the answers. And he's laying them down, okay? And then he goes back to Thessalonians and they're like, okay, well, now Pete and Rick won't quit talking about this. And he's like, okay. And so it's really interesting when you read it that way, because this is Paul addressing, and this is layered. So like, as the Thessalonian letters are getting out, the Corinthians are having issues and the Romans are having issues. And you start to see that, church issues, it's not new. And you can often go to a church issue that's highlighted in 1 Corinthians and go, and we're going to head this way, and then find the answer to where you're headed in Romans, because we function the same way today as we did back then. Okay? So
Romans is the only pre-visit.
Go ahead.
Romans is the only pre-visit
Yeah.
letter that went out.
Yeah. Romans, he addresses the Romans before he actually visited the Romans. Then we come to Matthew and Luke, get ridden. And then you have, and then to Mary Beth's point, you also have Ephesians, which is a pre-visit. He writes to the people at Ephesus before he visits them. And then you have pastoral reflections prior to the death of Paul. And then the development is a generation shift or the continuation of Luke, that is Acts. And then you have 2 Timothy. But now we go to the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew is written to a Jewish audience. He quotes the Old Testament 60 times. So that's why it's probably Jim's favorite gospel, because he spends a lot of time there. He challenged the messianic assumptions of the Jews. So when you read Matthew, there's a lot about, do you not know that he is the Messiah, the Messiah, the Messiah? And you can kind of sometimes think like, wow, Matthew, a little ADD, you keep going over the same. Well, he's doing that for a purpose. And this is one of the things, the green bubble, I want you guys to understand too. Because the Jews couldn't see the truth in their minds, Jesus committed the highest possible crime by making himself equal to God. Matthew wrote to his fellow Jews so that they might believe. That's the tension in this gospel. He's writing to an audience that are like, no, you don't understand. That guy from Nazareth, he broke the rule. The rule. And Matthew's like, no, he didn't. He came to fulfill the rule. You guys are mistaken. You guys kept looking for him to be like David, to be a king, to be this earthly. That wasn't his role. And so that's the tension. And it's written from Matthew's point of view. And one of the things I think is probably what I cling to the most when I'm watching the thing like The Chosen is Matthew constantly with his papyrus writing what he sees. Because I think that's highly accurate, because Matthew's writing style is very, very meticulous, very, very much on like, this person did this, this happened. Like, which would make sense also given Matthew's background as a tax collector, because tax collecting was different back then. You had to know all the numbers, the places, the names, the people who was trading, all that stuff. So I think some of the stuff about Matthew is accurately displayed. Gospel of Luke. So Luke is my favorite of the Gospels. It's written by a doctor. There is some historical evidence that Luke was brought up as a slave, not like as a slave that was being beaten, but like as a house slave. And his master paid for him to go to school. But the big medical school that Luke probably went to is the same school at about the same time period that Paul went to get his education at Tarsus. And so Tarsus was the big medical school as well. So there is debate on whether the two had met while they were in school and then reconnected later on. That may or may not have happened. What would be interesting, though, is if they did meet, it was before the road to Damascus that they met. So Luke would have met the Paul that hated Christians, and then met the Paul later on and went, whoa, and that could have been part of Luke's story. We don't know, but it's interesting. This is the first half of the historical narrative because Luke writes Acts as well. But here's what this is. It's the gospel written from Mary's eyewitness testimony. There is ample evidence that Luke was staying with John, the beloved, who was looking after Mary. And it's interesting because John doesn't write his books until after Mary has passed. So he was taking care of Mary, which is what he was commanded to do by Jesus. You know, son, mother, mother, son, that whole passage. And what's interesting is that is where the prayer of Mary and the Song of Mary are contained. And if you think about, Luke is very meticulous about how Jesus came into the world, which makes sense because Mary was very meticulous on like, this is how this was laid down. And so that's why so much of what we would call the Christmas story is centered around the book of Luke, because it's Mary's eyewitness of Jesus. So now we have, at this point, we have the eyewitness of Peter. We have the eyewitness of Matthew. We have the eyewitness of Mary. And so those are the first three that are laid out, and that's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Then the pattern continues. You have 1 Peter, Hebrews, 2 Peter. Peter dies in 68. Then you have Revelation, then the destruction of Jerusalem. And then Peter's pastoral reflections post Paul. And then which that should have been sorry, I copied those the wrong way. So forget the bottom two. Now we get the Gospel of John. So remember, John's part of the inner circle. If I could have somebody go to John 13:23 and someone go to John 20:30-31.
John 13:23. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him.
Okay. So this is what's funny. John is the most self-conscious in my book of all the writers of the Gospels. The other writers openly admit, hey, I'm Matthew. Hey, I'm John Mark. Hey, like they tell you who they are. John, this is the first time he references who he is in the gospel, in the 13th chapter, 23rd verse, the way we call it. And of course, we all know that like John didn't write 13:23, 13:24. That's going to happen later on. But it's at this point that he goes, the disciple that, that guy, that's him. And then if we go to John 20:30-31.
Jesus worked many other miracles for his disciples, and not all of them are written in this book. But these are written so that you will put your faith in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. If you have faith in him, you will have true life.
So I think this is important. John knows he's writing after the other three Gospels have been out. The early church has had it. And one of the things is people are like, what else did he do? What else did he do? Which is still things that we ask to this day, like, was that it? Or did he do other things? And here's John's answer. Yeah, he did so many things, I can't write them all down. But there's your answer. So to all of you who are ever going to ask, did he do anything else? Yes. But we're not going to write them all down. And that's important because I think when you look at the writing of the New Testament, that's also Jesus answering us, because we have lots of questions like, well, what else happened? What? Because we're just naturally curious. And this is God writing through his writer, John, going, lots of things. I did lots of things, but we're not going to focus on all these things. These are the things that you need to focus on so you have a relationship with me. And so my goal today was to kind of give you a background of how we got the New Testament, but also to try and challenge you that when you go back and read, don't read to replace your walk with God or anything, but read to see how God used each of these writers during a historical tension to answer questions that we're still asking today and to get that richness from it. The conclusion. The New Testament can be read in many ways. You can read it canonical. There's a chronological Bible, although people are saying that that's now not actually absolutely correct, but fine. You can read it however you want to. This was not that you have to read it one way or another. That's not what this was about. Understanding when it was written and the time at which books came into being in the early church provides insights into that time that it was a while before early Christians had the advantage that you and I have, the blessing that we can go to any part of the New or Old Testament and read. And my challenge to all of us is kind of to the point I think you're trying to make a little bit earlier, Joel. You look at what Christians then and Christians in many parts of the world today have to do to get to a Bible. I mean, I've had a friend that was the dad of one of the guys I ran track with, that he went and spent an entire summer in Kenya. And I remember him coming back as an elder that I respected, and Don saying, we walked 8 miles each way 3 times a week so people in this other village could actually hear the gospel, because they didn't even have one Bible in that village. And yet, I'm pretty sure, I'm not picking on Pete, but Pete's probably got more than one version of the Bible in his house. He has a computer. He has the ability to go to all sorts of things around the world and pull information that if he wants to dig into, what the word said in Greek, how that's been interpreted through the last 1,500 years, he could do it fairly quickly and probably have a lot of answers in a half hour. Whereas for many people throughout time, that was impossible. And even today is dang near impossible. And so we're very blessed with access to see those insights. And I think it just builds a richness into the fabric and texture of God's word. And then understand something. Because we have all these copies of the New Testament, you can 1000% stand and say it's not been altered. We can look at copies today, go back to look at copies 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 15, as much as 18 to almost 1900 years now ago, and see it hasn't been changed. And so it's written to stand the test of time as it has, it is, and it will continue to do so. So that's the study.
Hey, the guy, Anna, whatever, that really long name from Alexandria that put him in that order. What year was that they did that?
That was about 230, 240, somewhere back in there. Or it could be
And he was
340.
a Roman or what?
He was part of the Egyptian church.
Church.
But realize everybody from basically what you would say is basically, not exact line, but basically modern Libya, wrapped out all the way around the Mediterranean to Portugal. Most people had Roman names clearly into the 700s because Roman culture dominated. And so some people had two names. You might have my name is Pedro in Spain, but you went by, I am, Marcus, whatever, because that was your government name.
Your alias.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Which, to Pete's point about family genealogy, some people that are able to go back sometimes hit a snag because they see a fork in the road and they're like, wait, was his name this or was his name that? It's two different people. It's the same person. It was just one has a government name and then the other one was the familial name.
So much of this, Rick, I look at and it slaps me in the face. I mean, look at where do I get to grow? These folks, like you said, maybe they had one book, maybe they had part of one letter, maybe that was it. And yet maybe they just heard word of mouth. They didn't have any personal experience where they actually saw Jesus maybe they didn't hear about him until after he was gone, a lot of them. And yet their faith was such that they were, to quote the Bible, they were beaten, they were imprisoned, they were sawed in two, they were fed to animals, they were set on fire. To the story of the Roman legion, just stepped forward 10% at a time until they were all gone. And I don't know how many different translations of the Bible or versions of the Bible sitting on this bookshelf back here in different languages. I have Bibles in English and Spanish and whatever. I can look up anything. I can research anything. I can listen to books on the Bible on audiobooks. I can order them and buy them, and I can do all these things. And yet I will sometimes complain that, being a Christian is hard. No, right? And so then I think about these people, and I what a pitiful example I am of a follower of Christ when I compare myself to those folks who had so little and did so much. And so this is a great lesson. I love looking back into history like this because it's like cold water in my face. It says, look, dude, wake up, straighten up and fly right. You have so many advantages, but you're not taking advantage of them. And so anyway, I'm not saying that for anybody else. I'm just saying that that's the way it hits me.
I think there could be another view to consider. Of course, I can't go back in time and know for sure. When I think about God's character, just kind of the way he runs things and he keeps things even-handed. He doesn't show favoritism. Wherever someone's lacking, he steps in. And wherever someone's got an abundance, he's and I don't mean God is a communist. I just mean that God has this in his character, there's a sense of fairness. And I think I'm wondering if a first century Christian would look forward to us and say, you have porn on your phone? What? That must be incredibly hard. You don't go out and see daylight every day? What? That must be incredibly hard. You don't get together and just share about the gospel every day, because there's so much of this is word of mouth, right? There wasn't a book, but there was an oral tradition that was very strong. And instead of watching YouTube, you actually would interact with people and share and commune. So I'm wondering if there weren't some advantages actually that you had in the first century over what you had now. So close to the Son of God walking on earth too. That was pretty huge to have, because all those stories that were not written about in these books, they were being told through the gossip channels, through the news feed. So they were probably getting even a richer story than maybe we get. But yet, like you said, we can go back and look at the Old Testament and cross-reference it with the New Testament and look at the prophecies, So I'm wondering, if we summed it all up, would it be even? And this is just pontificating. I have no idea. And, it doesn't really have anything to do with the price of rice in China. But but it is kind of fun to go back and think, man, what would it have been like? So cool.
Well, I think to both of you guys said, and son, I will tell you from where I come from this. I often read the Bible looking for an answer. That produces a result. Sometimes I read the Bible because it's like, God, I'm in a crappy mood, and so I'm going to read your word. And I read the word, but I don't read the word, if you catch my meaning. I just read through it. And so there's sections of the Bible that I still go through, and I'm like, I've read through the book of Acts like more times than I have fingers and toes. This is a chunky, meaty section. How did I miss that? Well, evidently, the other 20 times I read through it, I was on one of those days where I was like, oh, got to read chapter 15. Done. And checked it off of a list and then really go through it. And like, I really challenge you guys to read the Council at Jerusalem, chapter 15, because it's mind-blowing when I actually slow down my roll and read it slowly. And I'm like, these are discussions that have happened in churches that I've been in my life. Like, what? And so to your point, Kelly, I don't know. I think they might be looking at us going, oh, you had that problem too. I also think it's interesting because when you understand the cultures, I mean, one of the big debates in the church globally is when to take communion. So you have some places it's every Sunday, other places it's only the first Sunday of the month. Some places it's every time they meet. And you go back, yeah, yeah, and you look at this time period, and to your point, Kelly, a lot of these people, they were meeting almost like we came together, because of COVID, when there were heavily government restrictions that were shutting churches down and doing stuff. They found creative ways to meet. So in some ways, they might look at our group and go, new technology, but yeah, that's kind of what we did. We were like, hey, we'll meet at the Shepherd's Den at 3:00, someone bring a scroll and try to get in there, or maybe they did it all from memory. But what I think is we don't see that God interacted with them, those before them, and us the exact same way. It's the consistency. And it's just looking and going, wow, I think one of the struggles that Christians have, and it's weird, if Deanna came and said, hey, when I was growing up, my great-grandfather sat us down on his knees and he taught us whatever the lesson was. None of us would sit there and look at Deanna and go, oh, well, what gives you the right to think you could repeat that with your kids? Everybody's like, oh, that's a really cool family tradition. That's some cool insights. Like, yeah, totally appropriate. Yeah, when it comes to the Bible, there's a lot of times people are like, yeah, but that was back then. That doesn't apply now. Yeah, it does. It most certainly does. and it should be carried with more reverence than, no offense to your great grandfather, I never met him, don't know, but
I haven't either.
yeah, but my point
Maybe
is,
my grandfather's. So
but in reference to that, like, it's not a tradition. It was where God, if you look at every one of these words, that God called a writer to write to attention to a time, because that was going to be important for everybody that followed him. You know, I've written some, Joel and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about some of the stuff. I've written some really good stuff on like wildlife. I doubt anybody's going to read it 10 years from now, let alone 100 years from now. That's just, it's not going to stand.
Maybe a Dead Sea Scroll.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I got a question. The Dead Sea Scrolls, when they were found, how many books basically did it back up of the Bible? The whole Bible? Half?
No, Old Testament. It was all Old Testament. So it would have been your favorite place, Jim. You would have been like just happy as a lark. No, it's very interesting. I could do a whole study on what I learned when I went through the classes. There is a thing, I don't know exactly how you have to do it today. I did 20 years ago, but the Huntington Library that's up in Los Angeles has, I think, 2 complete scrolls from the Dead Sea that are sealed. And you have to like a couple months in advance make an appointment, but you can go into the room with white gloves and you can put your fingers within like the thickness of glass away from them. And what's amazing is when I went in, I literally got emotional. I remember coming home to Mary Beth and she's like, "What's wrong with you?" And I'm like, that was amazing, because one of the scrolls that John the Baptist quoted from, they have like 4 copies. And John the Baptist was part of the community at Qumran. There's lots of writings and stuff about him being there. And he said, this is the closest you're going to get to touching someone who touched Jesus, because John most likely touched all 4 of these scrolls. And so what's separating you is the glove, glass, and the scroll that John read from. And it was like, that just put chills up my spine. It was like, you know, it's like getting a knife from grandpa and you're like, I got grandpa's fishing knife. Yeah.
I just want to thank Kelly for your perspective, because I think that was huge. Just to kind of accentuate that point, back then they had, like you said, they had the immediacy in time. They probably got the news the way people got news back then, which was word of mouth. Somebody's traveling down the Roman road and tells the next guy who tells the next guy. So they'd heard about many of these things. But I think the other thing is that they were living in the culture, so they didn't have to do what we have to do. So we perhaps were given so many opportunities and so much information so that we can go back and learn about the culture and learn about the history, so we have a point of reference. They lived that point of reference. And so, as I look at them and think they're so much more faithful than we are, it escapes me that we have problems too that they didn't have, but at the same time that they had a cultural reference that was just ingrained because they were living in it, and they had an understanding of it wasn't really history yet. It was an ongoing thing. If it was history, it was very recent history, and for us, it's not. And so thank you for that, Kelly. That was very enlightening. I really appreciate that point of view. That was great.
Another thing that's important about the Dead Sea Scrolls is it provided us a wealth of intel on how to translate the manuscripts that we had. It gave us, it was the missing piece that we needed to more accurately translate all of the previous manuscripts that we had. And one of the things that's when you look at all the different biblical translations, there's a marked difference between the translations that you get pre-Dead Sea Scrolls and the translations that you get post-Dead Sea Scrolls, because of our ability or our better ability to translate what we had and what we thought. And so the accuracy was raised by an order of magnitude. And that's why even the KJV has the new KJV, which is post Dead Sea translation post Dead Sea Scrolls.
Not to get meta here, but I think Rick's the only person that I know that kind of did a lesson where nature was heavily emphasized. And because we were talking about first century Christians, and I'm willing to bet a lot of their discussions about God had to do with, were closely connected to creation. Like, I saw the lamb born, and it made me think about, and I saw the sunrise, and oh, did you see that storm cloud when it came in? And there was all of these nature references that were reflecting God communicating with his people through nature. And I bet a lot of those discussions were about that. Whereas today, I've never once heard a sermon. Now, I'm sure that doesn't mean that they don't exist, but I personally have never in 40 years heard someone teach from the pulpit where the Bible was never used. They're only going to talk about creation and how creation shouts the wonders of God, right? And of course, most of us will remember Rick's lessons on the vine, right, and all the really cool things about that. But that, I think, if Rick were to teach that lesson, 2,000 years ago, people would be like, yeah, we talked about that last week. I mean, it wouldn't have been like, oh wow, as much as it was to us. So I think one thing that I kind of want to do to challenge myself is to look for God more in those areas instead of just being oblivious to the beautiful mountains or the lake or the ocean or whatever. Really just kind of think, okay, what am I supposed to hear from God with this? Because a lot of times I don't really pay attention to anything but my phone, so.
Yeah,
I think
it's
just as an artist, like one of the things that all the different colors of green outside, it's like, whoa, God did all these like nuances of green, and I don't know, sometimes just for you when you're out there, just that's one of the things I look at now, like, oh my gosh, it's really cool. And I just think about how much fun that must have been. How much fun creating that. Sorry, Rick.
To your point, Kelly, I had a young man in my troop. It was when our troop was almost all Korean, except for our boys and a couple others. And we had a guy who his dad was part of the Korean government and was head of trade for the Korean government with the United States on the Pacific Rim. And his dad was always absent from everything. His mom never came. They lived over by Biola, and Chris would sometimes ride his bike from Biola, which is up in La Habra, to Westminster, which was like 12 miles. There were plenty of other troops he could have went to, but he came to ours. And Chris was my kid who hated hiking, hated it. And like would do almost anything else scouting, but it's like not hiking. He was the kid who would volunteer to put up Scoutmaster's tents if MA didn't have to go hike, like always bartering. And we were up in Sequoia for a week with the boys, helping them get merit badges, doing stuff. And I got this bright idea. Later on, I decided as a Scoutmaster, not the brightest idea, but my bright idea was the last day before we drove home and broke camp, I was going to take the boys up for a sunrise mountaintop experience. And so found this lookout post, and we got up at like 3:30 in the morning, and you can imagine getting 30 boys up at 3:30 in the morning. Not a good recipe, but anyways, did it. We're heading up in the dark, headlamps on, and Chris comes up to me about halfway up, and he's like, "Look, old man, I'm going to beat you to the top." And I'm like, "You don't hike. Shut up." And so it became this competitive thing. I let him get like a couple of switchbacks ahead of me, then I'd blow by him, and we just kept us up. And finally, it's at that point where the sun's starting to break, and we just bolt, the two of us, running up the top of the hill. He obviously has more gas in him than I do, but I actually ended up beating him. And I get to the top and I'm bent over panting because I'm blown. And all of a sudden Chris turns around. And while we were sponsored by a church, and while many of the boys attended churches, most of them weren't Christians. And he turns around and you could see from this point Mount Whitney, and the sun's coming over it. And I'm ready for there's Mount Whitney thing, right? Because like Scoutmaster extraordinaire, going to do this. When Chris says, that's God saying good morning to all of us, and he falls to his knees. And I'm like, are you okay? And he's quiet. He accepted Jesus right then and there. And I did not know how to process that. I was like, because I was kind of doing your thing of like, there was no like youth pastor going, okay, we're all going to come forward. Who's going to like, there was no pulpit preaching. There was no Bible. There was God showing himself in nature. And that's what brought Chris. And he's the one kid that afterwards he graduated from college, got a really good job in San Diego, lived in a cruddy place in San Diego in Pacific Beach, saved all his money, and then walked in a year later, quit, and went and hiked throughout Asia and was literally at the base camp when they had the big thing at Everest, when the big avalanche happened, helped people evacuate, and came back and told me about how he shared everywhere he went that experience. And I'm like, well, so did you give him Bibles? Did you do this? He said, no, I just shared what happened. And I was like, so it still happens, Kelly. I'm not the guy to do it. But I just think it's interesting that God still uses his creation to get through to people beyond all the words and different creative things that speakers think they're going to do to lead people to Christ. God's like, nope, still got the playbook because I made it.
And the crazy thing is you can add me to the list of that happened. I was 18 years old and I was really an atheist. I mean, I had seen so much hypocrisy and I had zero interest in God at all. And this was the fall before I'm going to go to college. And I was hunting elk outside the Yellowstone buffer zone. So there's a national park called Yellowstone National Park. There's a mile, I believe it's a mile, around the park that you cannot hunt. You can't shoot into the park. So I'm hunting right along that boundary. And it's in the middle of, it's a place that you really, you need horses to get there because even four-wheelers are going to have a time because you're just straight up. It's very vertical to get there. Anyway, and I don't know. I'd never, actually, my dad took me there. I'd never been there before in my life. But it's not the normal place that you go hunting because if you shoot something, you're going to need a helicopter to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're a hunter, you want to drive and hunt with your truck. You don't want to get on a horse, go straight up so if you're getting like really vertical on a horse, the saddle horn, which is that thing that you wrap the rope around, it starts hitting you in the chest because you're going straight up and the horse is like bounding straight up.
And then there's that coming back down where that saddle horn's in a very uncomfortable place too.
yeah. And right. And, but you know what? You're so terrified that you're going to die coming down that you don't even think about it. To be honest, at least I was. But anyway, my point is that this is not normal. Like this is not where I've ever hunted before. And it's not normal that I'm going here. And I don't even know why. And I don't want to go because it's 2:30 in the morning and I'm riding a horse in the dark, going up. And by the way, horses will fall asleep while they're walking. Like,
did not know that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You experience it firsthand when they start to stumble because they're falling asleep. They're nodding off while they're walking, and you got to smack them, like not cruelly, but you got to smack them to wake them up so that you don't both don't end up in a cold creek somewhere. But anyway, my point is this is such an outlier. It's such an unusual event that this has like God's fingerprints on it. You know what I mean? It's like, why would, and it anyway, it was just this. So I get there, and starting to get emotional. So anyway, I get there, and the sun's coming up, and I start to go, wow, like, oh my God, this is like a postcard. Like, where am I? And a very, I don't remember. I think it was like I think it was a 6 or 8 point bull was. There was a bunch of does coming out. I'm sorry, does. Cows coming out. Elk cow, female elk that were running down the side of the mountain. And there was a big bull. One of these like wall hangers, that you want, and the scene was so overwhelming from a nature standpoint. I couldn't pull the trigger. Like I just had to set I was like in awe, and my brain was just not working anymore, because a hunter would have made that shot like a long time ago. And I just said, I don't want this to end, because as soon as I pull that trigger, things are going to end. Now I'm going to have to go to work. It's going to be brutal, and a lot of sweat. And I'm just like, and wasn't out of laziness. It was just out of awe. And so those, like you said, those moments, and because of that marked the first moment where I thought, well, maybe there is a God, and maybe I don't know everything, and maybe I should be a little more open to something spiritual. And then there was just all these series of events that drew me in, and the first step was nature for me.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you very much for watching. I'm very grateful that you did. If you'd like to see more lessons like this, you can do so by going to our website, thefirstchurchontheright.org. There's a link in the description. Or you can follow the channel on Rumble, YouTube, or you can follow my GunGuyTV channel if you want to. On X, I post these videos there as well. Once again, links are in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful week, and God bless.